In 1856, a mild-mannered engineer walked into a government meeting in London and placed a set of blueprints on the table. He had spent years designing them. He explained, calmly, methodically, that London's sewage system was a catastrophe waiting to happen, that the river was dying, that people were going to get sick, that the city needed to act now. The politicians looked at the cost estimate, and they sent him home. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, and 2 years later, the most powerful government on earth would come crawling back to him because the smell coming off the River Thames had gotten so violent, so suffocating, so completely unbearable that members of Parliament couldn't hold a debate without physically gagging at their own desks. This is not the story of a city that had a sewage problem. This is the story of a city that knew it had a sewage problem, ignored the man who could fix it, and paid a catastrophic price. And the most remarkable part? The solution Bazalgette eventually built still protects London today. Let's go back to the beginning. By the early 1800s, London was growing faster than any city in human history. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring factories and wealth, it brought people, hundreds of thousands of them, pouring into the city looking for work. And within a few decades, London's population exploded past 2 million. 2 million people in a city designed for a fraction of that number, with no sewage infrastructure to match. What existed instead was a patchwork of ancient cesspits dug beneath homes, essentially holes in the ground where waste collected until someone came to empty them. In theory, that system worked. In practice, as the population exploded, the cesspits overflowed. Waste seeped into basements, into streets, into the groundwater below the city. And when it rained, which is often because this is England, everything washed into the same place, the Thames. And it wasn't just households. Slaughterhouses operating along the river poured blood, offal, and animal remains directly into it. Factories discharged industrial chemicals, dye runoff, and manufacturing waste around the clock. And the city's primitive drainage system, designed centuries earlier to move rainwater, had been quietly repurposed to carry sewage too. Every drain led to the same destination. The Thames became a slow-moving, miles-long accumulation of everything London wanted to forget. And for years, people looked the other way, because in cooler months you could almost pretend it wasn't there. Almost.
The summer of 1858 arrived with no mercy. An unusual, brutal heat settled over London and refused to leave. And what that heat did to the Thames was not just unpleasant, it was chemical. The combination of rising temperatures, falling water levels, and 2 decades of accumulated biological waste created something that wasn't quite a river anymore. It was a fermentation vat. A slow-cooking biological reactor sitting in the middle of Britain's capital city. The smell that rose off it wasn't just bad. Witnesses described it as a physical presence, a wall of odor that hit you before you even saw the water. People vomited in the streets without warning. Shopkeepers shuttered their doors in the middle of the day. Restaurants emptied out because nobody could eat within half a mile of the riverbank. And if you were unlucky enough to lean over a bridge railing and look down, you could watch bubbles rising to the surface, not from fish, from decomposing waste releasing gases from the riverbed below. The stench spread across every neighborhood, regardless of wealth or class. It crept through open windows into private clubs and drawing rooms. It soaked into the curtains of expensive townhouses. It followed carriages through the streets. It had no respect for the class system that London was built on. And that, more than anything, is what forced the crisis into the open. Because when the smell reached the working poor, it was tragic but ignorable. When it reached Parliament, that was a different matter entirely. The Houses of Parliament sat directly on the banks of the Thames, which in the summer of 1858 meant they sat directly next to the source. Members of Parliament arrived to work in June of that year and walked into a building that functioned essentially as a gas chamber. They tried soaking the chamber's curtains in chloride of lime, a pungent chemical disinfectant, hoping to overpower the smell from outside. It didn't work. They tried holding handkerchiefs over their faces mid-debate. They tried scheduling sessions as short as possible to minimize exposure. Historical records document politicians physically gagging during parliamentary business. Some accounts describe members fleeing the building entirely rather than endure another minute inside. And this matters, not just as a grotesque anecdote, but because of what it represented. These were the men who ran the British Empire, who controlled territories across 4 continents, whose navy patrolled every major ocean on Earth. And they couldn't sit in their own building because a river 200 yards away had become too disgusting to exist near. The humiliation was total, and it was at this moment, not before, not during earlier cholera outbreaks, not during years of public complaint, that Parliament finally decided to act. Which raises the uncomfortable question, why did it take this long?
Here's the twist that makes this story genuinely fascinating. When Londoners panicked about the Thames in 1858, they weren't just disgusted, they were terrified. Because at the time, the dominant scientific theory about disease was something called miasma theory, the belief that illness was caused by bad air, that foul smells were themselves the mechanism of infection, that if something stank badly enough, breathing near it could kill you. And given London's recent history with cholera, which had killed thousands in brutal outbreaks across the city, that fear felt completely rational. But miasma theory was wrong, completely scientifically wrong. Cholera isn't airborne, it's waterborne, spread through contaminated drinking water, not contaminated air. A physician named John Snow had actually demonstrated this several years earlier, mapping a cholera outbreak in Soho to a single contaminated water pump. But the medical establishment largely dismissed his findings. So in 1858, London's population was operating on the wrong scientific framework. They feared the smell. They should have feared their water supply. And here is the horrifying irony. London's drinking water was being pulled from the Thames, the same Thames that was full of sewage. So while the smell itself posed no direct biological threat, the river absolutely was killing people, just not through the mechanism anyone understood. Which means the Great Stink triggered the right solution for the wrong reason. London fixed its sewage system because politicians couldn't breathe, not because they understood the waterborne transmission of cholera. They stumbled into saving their city. Which brings us back to Joseph Bazalgette. After years of being ignored, the Metropolitan Board of Works finally gave him full authority to build what he'd been proposing all along. And what Bazalgette designed was breathtaking in its ambition. His plan intercepted sewage before it reached the Thames, instead of the existing system where hundreds of small drains discharged directly into the river. Bazalgette designed a network of massive underground intercepting sewers running parallel to the Thames on both its north and south banks. These sewers collected the flow from all the smaller drains above them, and rather than dumping waste into central London's water supply, they carried it far downstream, past the city entirely, where it could be discharged safely into the tidal estuary. The numbers were staggering. Over 1,000 miles of new street-level sewers, more than 80 miles of major underground brick tunnels, some large enough to drive a carriage through, massive pumping stations built to lift sewage over natural elevation obstacles, and critically, the construction of the Thames embankments themselves. To lay the largest sewer pipes, Bazalgette's team had to reclaim land from the river's edge. They essentially pushed the Thames back.
And in doing so, they created the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments, the riverside promenades that Londoners and tourists walk along today. The embankments weren't decorative, they were the roof of the sewer system built underneath them. But here is the detail that separates Bazalgette from every other engineer on this project. When calculating the diameter of his main sewer pipes, Bazalgette ran the numbers for London's current population. Then he stopped, and he doubled the diameter, because he understood something the politicians around him didn't. London wasn't finished growing, and if he built for the city as it was, the system would be obsolete within a generation. His critics called it wasteful. His oversized pipes, they argued, were an unnecessary expense. Those pipes are still in use today. More than 160 years later, the sewers Bazalgette built, the ones they almost didn't let him build, still formed the backbone of London's sanitation infrastructure. He didn't just solve the problem of 1858, he solved problems London wouldn't have for another century.
Construction on the new sewer system began in earnest in 1859 and continued through the 1860s. It was one of the largest civil engineering projects the Victorian era had ever attempted. Workers dug through a living city, beneath streets still crowded with traffic, below neighborhoods still packed with residents, installing brick tunnels by hand in conditions that were brutal and dangerous. And gradually, measurably, the results came. Cholera outbreaks, which had ravaged London in 1832, 1849, 1854, declined sharply. The 1866 outbreak, which hit areas not yet connected to the new system, killed over 4,000 people in East London. Areas already served by Bazalgette sewers were almost entirely spared. The evidence was now undeniable. Clean water infrastructure saved lives, and London was finally building it, not because of wisdom, not because of scientific consensus, not because of responsible long-term planning, because politicians couldn't tolerate the smell coming through their windows. The Great Stink of 1858 is remembered as one of history's most grotesque public health crises, but that framing misses the deeper story. The Thames didn't become toxic overnight. It became toxic over decades of deliberate inaction. The warnings existed, the science existed, the engineer existed, blueprints in hand, sitting in a government office being told the cost was too high. And it took the most powerful legislative body in the world being driven out of its own building by the consequences of its own negligence to finally do what needed doing years earlier. The Great Stink wasn't a story about sewage, it was a story about what happens when the people insulated from a problem are suddenly forced to live inside it. The moment Parliament smelled what the rest of London had been breathing for decades, everything changed overnight. Not because the problem got worse, because the people with the power to fix it finally couldn't ignore it. And Joseph Bazalgette, the man they dismissed, the man they sent home, the man whose blueprints collected dust in a government drawer for years, built something so far-sighted, so precisely engineered, so ruthlessly future-proofed, that a century and a half later, his work still runs beneath the city, invisible, unnoticed, keeping millions of people safe. The greatest engineer Victorian London produced almost never got the chance to build anything because the people in charge couldn't see the problem until it was literally under their noses, and by then the river had been rotting for 20 years. History has the wildest, most unique tales. If you wish to join the journey with us, like and subscribe for more, because we're just getting started. Stay timeless.